In 2287, a city southeast of Boston found itself at the center of a battle between a ruthless and rising mercenary company and an aging and disintegrating company of volunteer defenders. When a small group of survivors escaped the massacre that ensued, no one could have known how dramatically their survival would reshape the Commonwealth. I'm the Irresolute Cartographer, and this is the story of Quincy. We'll start this with an examination of the sites surrounding Quincy in the Fallout universe and in the real world. We'll then move to the layout of the city in the Fallout universe and how it compares to the city in the real world. We'll examine the history of Quincy in the Fallout universe and a brief history of Quincy in the real world. We'll close with some of my notes on this content. With that said, let's get started. In the Fallout universe, Quincy is located in the southeastern part of the Commonwealth that we get to explore in Fallout 4. On the peninsula northeast of town, the Atom Cats Garage serves as the home and workshop for the power armor-clad Atom Cats. On the peninsula east-northeast of Quincy, settlers have established the Warwick Homestead. East of Quincy, the wreck of the FMS Northern Star serves as the home for a group of Norwegian ghouls. East-southeast of Quincy, the old Poseidon Energy Power Plant is now home to a group of raiders. West-southwest of Quincy, the Wilson Atomatoys Factory has become an outpost for the super mutants. Farther to the west-southwest, within the swamps created by the war, the Murkwater construction site sits ready to host a settlement, if the local Mirelurk Queen can be dealt with. West of Quincy, the Suffolk County Charter School is host to strangely pink feral ghouls. West-northwest of Quincy, the old Granite Quarry known as Quincy Quarries is home to a group of ghoulified raiders. Beneath the site, Vault 88 sits unfinished and ready for construction. Northwest of Quincy, the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston has been flooded and taken over by raiders. North-northwest of Quincy, the park and campgrounds of Neponset Park have become infested with Mirelurks. Let's now compare the locations of real-world sites that can be found in-game with their locations in-game. We'll start with municipalities. Boston, found north of Quincy in-game, is just under 8 miles north of Quincy in the real world. Hyde Park, the aforementioned neighborhood of Boston, found northwest of Quincy in-game, is about 6 miles west of Quincy in the real world. Neponset Park, found northwest of Quincy in-game, is a representation of the real-world Neponset Park Reservation, found just over 3 miles northwest of Quincy in real life. Warwick Homestead, found east-northeast of Quincy, is an in-game representation of the real-world Nut Island Sewage Treatment Plant, found about 3 miles northeast of Quincy. The Quincy Quarries, found west-northwest of Quincy in-game, are a representation of the Quincy Quarries Reservation found less than 2 miles southwest of Quincy in the real world. With the sites around Quincy covered, let's consider the layout of the city itself. In the real world, the city is bordered by the Massachusetts and Quincy Bays to the north and northeast, the Fore River to the east, Braintree, Massachusetts to the south, Randolph to the southwest, Milton to the west, and the Neponset River to the northwest. The core of the city is an urban area, but it's surrounded by suburban neighborhoods, and the limits of the city includes the heavily wooded Blue Hills Reservation. The eastern coastline of the city is a dockyard on the Fore River, while the rest of the coast is a mix of beaches, marshes, and yards. The heart of the city is fairly jumbled, but some of the neighborhoods are laid out on grids, usually parallel and perpendicular to the closest body of water. Aside from their locations on the coast, the other two things that the real-world and in-game city share are the Quincy Center Station on the red line of the MTA and a highway. In the real world, this is Interstate 93, and it's partially in the ground, while it's an elevated highway in-game. The city in-game is mainly contained to the urban center, but there are a few suburban homes to the south. The streets of the city center are a bit jumbled like the real world, but they don't resemble the layout of the real-world city. In-game, the city center is surrounded by swamps to the southwest and south, and coastal marsh to the southeast. Alright, comparisons aside, let's get to the composition of Quincy in the Fallout universe as it's represented in Fallout 4. Quincy is home to 14 houses, apartments, both standalone and those above shops. There are camps on the neighboring elevated highway. There are several shops, including a liquor store, a gun store, a pharmacy, a super-duper mart, and Fenton's Foodstuffs. There are at least 2 restaurants, a diner, and Pinelli's Bakery. There's at least 1 service business at the strangely well-stocked Red Rocket gas station north of town. There are 2 bus stops, the metro station, a park and ride, and a parking garage. There's a warehouse, a graveyard that also serves as a farm, a church, a theater, a plutonium well, a police station, a radio tower, and a pair of Pulaski preservation shelters. With the composition of the city covered, let's get to the history of Quincy in the Fallout universe. Much of the history of Quincy before the war has been lost to time, but there are a few notes and terminals and things that we can glean from environmental clues. If we assume that Quincy in the Fallout universe has a similar origin to the real-world Quincy, then it was settled in 1625. It was an industrial city through much of the 20th century, before its economy shifted into the professional and service industries. It served as a commuter suburb of Boston, with workers traveling to and from via the local highways, buses, and the MTA. Some found work in the Poseidon Energy Plant, producing power for the region. Others worked at the Wilson Automatoys plant, where the production line was shifting from the company's signature Giddy-Up Buttercup toy to producing mines for the war effort. At Suffolk County Charter School, students were being fed a pink paste as part of the Nutritional Alternative Paste program, and some of the teachers were starting to notice a pink tint to their skin. At the quarry, workers were cutting granite in order to hide the construction of Vault 88. In the last days before the bombs, the noise created by this work would prove too much of a distraction to author Charles Dieter Jr. Mr. Dieter, who had arrived at the neighboring Neponset Park on October 20th after a fight with his wife, was attempting to write a novel. On Saturday, October 23, 2077, after having been driven mad from attempting to write through the noise, Charles took a rifle to the outskirts of the quarry with murder on his mind. As he wrote his final journal entry, cursing the quarry workers and his wife, a new noise was added to the cacophony. The sound of the civil defense sirens. Nukes were falling across the world. I can't say I know what happened to Mr. Dieter at that moment, but the world was coming to an end around him. As the bombs detonated, electromagnetic pulses fried electronic equipment. A Stingray jet slammed into the nearby elevated highway. Not far away, the cab of an 18-wheeler was thrown from the same elevated highway, falling through the roof of a small business. The Earth shook dramatically as the force of the bombs broke the crust of the planet. The MTA derailed. Homes collapsed or sank into the earth. In Hyde Park and around Quincy to the west, south, and east, the ground fell, and the water of the Massachusetts Bay rushed in. The Norwegian cargo ship FMS Northern Star, its systems fried by the bombs, began to drift off the coast. As the tectonic shifting continued, a wave crashed over the coast and drove the ship ashore. The now stranded sailors of the beached ship would soon be bathed in radiation. North of town, a section of elevated highway crumbled, dropping a hazardous materials truck to the earth below, where it dumped its cargo of waste barrels into the quarry. In the lockup beneath the Quincy police station, a prisoner who was left to rot began to try to tunnel out of their cell using a spoon. As fallout began to drop across the city, those who had shelters prepared to ride out the worst of the radiation. On the south side of Quincy, Matt and Carol Peabody ran for the shelter, only to have it closed just before they got there. As the radiation levels rose, they ghoulified. Little did they know, their son Billy was going through a similar experience north of Quincy. Much of the history of Quincy from 2077 to 2287 has been lost, but we can pick up the story of the city and its surroundings 210 years after the bombs. The little crabs of Neponset Park had grown into mirelurks, infesting one of the old cabins by laying their eggs within. At an old Red Rocket gas station and garage northeast of the city, a friendly gang of power armor enthusiasts known as the Atom Cats had settled in. The wreck of the FMS Northern Star may have been rotting down to nothing, but the crew was still up and about, having been ghoulified by the radiation. Raider gangs controlled Hyde Park, the Poseidon Energy Plant, and the old quarry. The pinkening students of Suffolk County charter schools had become pink feral ghouls. Super mutants, dumped out of the Institute's FEV research program, had seized the Wilson Automatoys factory and used it as a base to raid caravans and nearby outposts. At the Nut Island Waste Treatment Plant, the Warwick family had moved in and established a settlement. The forests to the south and west of Quincy had become brackish swamps after centuries submerged in the water of the bay. Matt and Carol Peabody, who had roamed the wastes for a time after the bombs, had returned to their ruined home on the south side of Quincy. In the heart of the area, the ruins of the city of Quincy were occupied by a community of wastelanders. These people had fortified the ruins with a set of walls, established a farm in the old graveyard, and operated a market in the center of the city. We don't know the names of all the members of this community, but we can at least talk about a few. The community had an experienced and knowledgeable mechanic named Sturgis who maintained a friendly relationship with the neighboring Atom Cats. Through their friendship, Sturgis had obtained a pair of fixer-upper power armor chassis for the community. The local pharmacy was operated by the Long family, June, Marcy, and their young son Kyle. The community had a resident psychic, Mama Murphy, who could, through the use of chems, enter a state of prognostication she referred to as the Sight. The community was headed by Mayor Jackson, a man dedicated to the security of his people. Along with this, we know little more than the names of a few other community members, Sloan, Irma, and Natalie. While we know there were many more, we don't know anything about these people because of the event known as the Quincy Massacre. Sometime in 2287, Mama Murphy received a terrible vision of death that hung over the entire community. Though the Longs had refused to sell her any drugs from their pharmacy, she'd managed to purchase some jet from a passing caravan. Mama Murphy spread the news of this vision to all who would listen. While the Longs ignored her warning as the ramblings of an old junkie, Sturgis and Mayor Jackson believed her. The mayor broadcast a call for help as some of the citizens reinforced the walls. Though many in town weren't expecting these visions to come to anything, the arrival of the gunners proved them accurate. By this time in the history of the Commonwealth, the gunners were the most ruthless and feared mercenaries around. The town quickly organized their forces, but it was clear that this wouldn't be enough to withstand the assault for long. Luckily for the people of Quincy, this is when the Minutemen arrived. Attacking the rear of the gunners, the Minutemen were able to rout the assaulting force and push into town. Unfortunately for the people of Quincy, the Minuteman force was small in number. They had at one time been a force to be reckoned with, but years of poor management meant that only a small group of the volunteer militia responded when called. These few remaining defenders were led by Colonel Hollis and his second-in-command, Preston Garvey. Colonel Hollis ordered Garvey to strengthen the defenses of the city, as Sturgis worked to restore the power armor from the Atom Cats. In the fear that they wouldn't be able to hold the city against a full-on assault from the gunners, Colonel Hollis put out a call for more Minutemen to assemble in Quincy. June and Marcy Long's son Kyle was in awe of the Minutemen, and he followed Colonel Hollis around town. Kyle was so impressed with their courage and resilience that he told his parents that he would be a Minuteman when he grew up. As it turned out, the Minutemen really could have used him, as the call for reinforcements seemed to fail completely. The gunners continued to assault the town, and the Minutemen did everything they could to improve the town's defenses, shoring up the walls, filling the stairs up from the Metro Park and Ride, and establishing rooftop corridors. This would end up being the high point for the defense of Quincy. Everything started going downhill around the time Kyle, who had been following Minutemen patrols around town, took a bullet in the leg. He was wounded and wouldn't be able to walk well for the time being, but he was alive. Not long after this, it appeared that the call to arms had finally been answered when another Minuteman appeared at the gate. Colonel Hollis welcomed this man and took him to meet Mayor Jackson. The people of Quincy then watched in bewilderment as the colonel and the mayor escorted the new arrival out of town, screaming at him about treason. In a sign of just how far the Minutemen had fallen since their peak, Clint, this new arrival and a 10-year veteran of the Minutemen, wasn't there as the forerunner of a Minutemen relief force. He was at the head of the gunner force attacking the town. Clint had hoped to appeal to the mayor to stand down, but when the mayor had refused, he prepared to enact his final plan. Colonel Hollis was worried. Clint's time with the Minutemen had provided him with tactical know-how. As it turns out, the colonel's fears were vindicated when the gunners appeared suddenly all around them within the town walls. In less than an hour, the defenders were put down in a bloodbath. Only a group of 20 citizens of Quincy and Minutemen managed to take flight, led away to the north by Preston Garvey. The strategy for the attack that Clint carried out, or Lieutenant Clint as the gunners called him, was to take the high ground in the dark of night before the defenders of Quincy had the chance to respond. The high ground in this case was territory the defenders hadn't even considered at risk for assault, the elevated highway that ran right past the town. Lieutenant Clint blew one of the supports of the elevated highway, allowing his gunners to use the fallen section as a ramp. They bypassed the defensive perimeter and descended upon the town from above. The gunners captured Colonel Hollis alive, giving Lieutenant Clint the opportunity to execute him in front of his gunners. Some of the gunners under his command had questioned his loyalties, and he had hoped that this act, along with sending a group after the escapees, would quiet any dissent. The bodies of the Minutemen and the citizens were gathered up and burned in a pile. Quincy was theirs. Clint ordered the establishment of a radio connection with their headquarters in the Galaxy News Network building to the west, integrating their new post into their holdings. In the aftermath of the capture, Lieutenant Clint worked to reinforce his position. While he now held the respect of most of the rank-and-file gunners under his command, two of his senior staff, Sergeants Baker and Tessa, were less loyal. He gifted these two the suits of power armor that Sturgis had been working on in hopes of buying them off. Sergeant Tessa, a former raider, had been with the gunners for 3 years, and she couldn't stand having been passed over for a leadership position in favor of this outsider. When the carrot didn't work, Lieutenant Clint tried the stick, assigning Sergeant Tessa the work of exterminating the rad scorpions that were infesting the old Super Duper Mart parking garage. The work there was dangerous and grueling. No matter the number of rad scorpions slain, they just seemed to keep coming back. This was exactly what Lieutenant Clint had been counting on. He wanted to keep her out of the camp as long as possible to keep her views from poisoning the minds of the others. After days of fighting the rad scorpions, Tessa decided to take a break. She rigged the garage entrance with explosive traps and went back to camp. She got her armor repaired and had been planning on revealing tender feelings for Sergeant Baker when the group that Lieutenant Clint had sent to chase Garvey's party returned. The pursuit had failed. The gunners had given up the chase at Jamaica Plain. She had considered going after these people herself before the lieutenant had sent the group after them, so this failure to destroy the Minutemen was proof to her that Lieutenant Clint was playing both sides against each other. She held the strong belief that one couldn't trust a traitor. Clint had betrayed his Minutemen brethren. How long would it be until he betrayed the gunners? Sergeant Baker tried to get her to fall in line, but she wasn't having it. Feeling that his position was being undermined, Lieutenant Clint sent Baker and Tessa back to GNN to talk to his superior, Captain West. The lieutenant didn't just clamp down on dissent in his mission to legitimize himself, though. He made the point of getting the typical gunner blood type tattoo. Upon their return, Lieutenant Clint noted that Sergeant Baker was ready to work under his direction, but if anything, Sergeant Tessa had become more insubordinate. He sent them out to scout for local threats and found them at 3 locations. He ordered Sergeant Baker to fire a couple of rockets at the raiders of the Quincy Quarries, just to let them know who's boss. They decided to leave the super mutants at Wilson Automatoys alone for the time being. With all their power armor, Lieutenant Clint viewed the Atomcats as a potential threat, but also as a potential distraction to get his underlings to quiet down about having not finished off the Minutemen. Along with this, other gunners infiltrated the raiders of Hyde Park and let the fear of spies and double agents lead to violent witch hunts that were eliminating the raiders without the need to attack them directly. Lieutenant Clint wasn't worried about the party that had escaped. In his mind, Preston Garvey was no threat, and the Minutemen were never going to rear their heads again. The gunners, not the Minutemen, would be the group to secure the wasteland. In the end, Lieutenant Clint may have been an excellent tactician, overseeing the capture of the heavily fortified Quincy, but he made a massive strategic error in letting Preston Garvey and the other survivors get away. Garvey's party may have lost 75% of its people over the next month as they fled north, but they survived. Garvey's fanatical belief in the Minutemen became the foundation of a new and restored movement. Not long after they escaped, the Minutemen started to grow geometrically under the command of their new general, the sole survivor of Vault 111. Should the sole survivor choose to do so, they can take revenge for their fallen brethren. Alright, that pretty much covers the history of Quincy in the Fallout universe, so let's look at the real-world history of the city. I've covered the general geological history of Massachusetts before, so let's move on to the native history of the area around Quincy. At the start of the 17th century, Quincy was home to the Neponset band of the Massachusetts tribe. Like the other Massachusetts, the Neponset hunted, fished, and farmed, growing fields of corn, beans, and squash. They also quarried stone for tools and weapons. In 1616, a great plague ravaged the native population of the region. Likely brought on through contact with European traders, trappers, and fishermen, the coastal Massachusetts lost up to 80% of their population. This included many of their warriors. Tribes that lived further inland from the coast were less affected, and thus they took advantage of the weakened Massachusetts, attacking their villages. It was in this way that Patuxent, the Massachusetts village that once sat at the site of Plymouth, was destroyed. I mentioned in my video on Medford and Malden how the Massachusetts sachem Nunapashamet was felled at this time, leaving the squaw sachem of Mystic in charge. When the Mayflower arrived at nearby Plymouth on December 21st, 1620, the Massachusetts were just beginning to recover from the devastation. The Neponset sachem, when the Pilgrims landed, was Chickatawbut, who controlled much of the surrounding region and had his summer seat at Passamaquoddy, where Quincy sits today. The Pilgrims met with Chickatawbut in Plymouth in 1621, and the two sides signed a treaty there. That same year, Plymouth Colony Commander Miles Standish and the guide Squanto visited the area at the mouth of the Neponset River. In 1625, the first English post on the site of Quincy was established by a party led by Captain Wollaston. They named the settlement Mount Wollaston in his honor. When Captain Wollaston departed for Virginia, control of the post went to Wollaston's associate, Thomas Morton. The Puritans of Plymouth were not fans of Thomas Morton. During his tenure, the settlement was renamed Marymount, a translation of Passamaquoddy, the native name for the site. He was accused of constant drunkenness and maintaining a harem of native women. The Pilgrims also claimed to witness the erection of a maypole, a pagan symbol, on May Day, a pagan holiday. In 1627, Morton was arrested by Miles Standish for, among other offenses, selling guns to the native tribes. From what I've found, selling guns to the natives, while illegal, was a largely unpunished practice at the time, so it's likely that this was more of a personal grievance. Morton was shipped back to England, where he was arrested by the Puritans there. In 1630, the area was incorporated as part of Dorchester, territory Chickatawbut allowed the settlers to occupy. In 1633, there was another outbreak of smallpox that took the life of Chickatawbut. This was the same outbreak that took the sons of Nanapashamet and Medford. In September 1634, the area became part of Boston in an ordered enlargement by the General Court. In 1640, it again changed hands and became the northern reaches of the settlement of Braintree. From 1644 to 1645, John Winthrop the Younger, the son of the colonial governor John Winthrop, worked to establish an iron furnace in Braintree. At the time, all the iron products used in the colonies had to be imported from across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, the chosen site in Braintree wasn't suited to the effort, as the water power available wasn't enough to power the machinery. Richard Leader, a merchant with expertise in iron manufacturing, was hired. He chose a new site for the ironworks near Lynn, Massachusetts, a site that had readier access to bog iron and the requisite water power from the Saugus River to run the operation. Hammersmith, later renamed Saugus Ironworks, opened in 1646, and the Braintree furnace closed the next year. As the number of English settlers swelled over the decades, the Massachusetts found themselves being pushed off their land, sometimes violently. In 1657, Ponkapoag Plantation was established as a town for, quote, praying Indians, unquote. Many Neponset were relocated to Ponkapoag by missionaries to protect them from the influx of immigrants. In 1667, when it became suspected that the Neponset were attacking the English, they were warned not to venture more than a mile from Ponkapoag without being accompanied by an Englishman. Despite the lack of evidence, the men of Ponkapoag were then relocated to internment camps. When they were finally returned a few years later, the men were required to answer roll call in the mornings. King Philip's War broke out in 1675. The people of Ponkapoag Plantation had built defensive palisades to protect them from Philip's men. But despite this, it was feared by the local English populations that they might join him in his war. The natives of Ponkapoag were again relocated, this time to Deer Island in Boston Harbor. They lived a horribly cold and hungry life on the island. A petition was brought before the General Court to destroy them or ship them out of Massachusetts. When the treaty with these natives was then brought before the General Court, it was ordered that they be returned to the mainland. They were subsequently returned to Ponkapoag, sans the unfortunate souls that lost their lives in the process. Over the coming centuries, the Ponkapoag Plantation would see its 6,000 acres sold off or leased by guardians appointed to protect the natives. By 1827, the last of the land was sold off. In 1869, the Act of Enfranchisement passed, making all natives in Massachusetts citizens and dissolving the tribes they belonged to. We're now getting ahead of ourselves and finishing off the story of the Neponset. Over the course of the first decades of the 18th century, Quincy, or Braintree as it was still known at the time, became the birthplace for many of the revolutionaries that made the American Revolution possible. These individuals include Abigail Adams, John Hancock, and Sylvanus Thayer. John Adams would of course go on to become the second president of the United States, and his son John Quincy Adams would go on to become the sixth. The Quincy and John Quincy Adams comes from John Quincy, Abigail Adams' maternal grandfather. John Quincy also served as the namesake for Quincy when the town was established in 1792. At the turn of the 19th century, Quincy had a population of 1,081. In 1826, the Granite Railway, one of the first railways in the country, was established in Quincy, bringing granite from the Quincy Quarry to the Neponset River. The granite was then shipped to Charlestown, where it was used to build the Bunker Hill Monument. The granite from Quincy's quarries was very popular, and stone cutting served as a prominent industry in Quincy until the closure of the quarries in 1963. We'll come back to the quarries later, but in 1845 the Old Colony Railroad linked Quincy to Boston, and the city began to become a suburb. In the 1870s, Francis W. Parker, superintendent of the Quincy school system, developed the Quincy method for teaching. This method, based on the dismissal of rote learning and the promotion of experience-based education, improved the test scores of the local students before being picked up by other districts and spreading. In 1888, Quincy was incorporated as a city. Along with quarrying granite, one of the other large industries in Quincy over the centuries was shipbuilding. I've had trouble getting an exact origin point for the shipbuilding industry here, but I've seen it listed as starting as early as the 17th century. The industry really took off with the founding of the Four River Shipyard in 1901. The shipyard started as an engine company founded by Thomas A. Watson, the same Watson that developed the telephone with Alexander Graham Bell. The site changed hands multiple times over the next 85 years and produced a vast array of vessels, from submarines for the Japanese to use in the Russo-Japanese War, to aircraft carriers for use against the Japanese in the Second World War, to the first nuclear-powered surface vessels, including the only nuclear-powered cargo ship the U.S. ever built, the NS Savannah. In 1910, Quincy entered the budding field of aeronautics with the opening of the Harvard-Boston Aero Meet in the area of town known as Squantum. This Aero Meet, taking place just 7 years after the first flight at Kitty Hawk, was very well attended. The audience included notable spectators such as President Taft, Boston Mayor John F. Fitzgerald, and the future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A seaplane hangar and the Harvard landing strip were taken over by the Navy for training purposes, but they were abandoned in favor of the warmer Pensacola, Florida in 1917. In 1927, Denison Airport opened on the site, in an effort headed by Amelia Earhart. In 1942, the Navy reclaimed the site for Squantum Naval Air Station. The air station closed in 1953 when the operation shifted to Naval Air Station South Weymouth, which was itself closed down in 1997. The area that once hosted Squantum Naval Air Station was redeveloped to host Squantum Point Park, the Marina Bay neighborhood, and a Boston Scientific facility. Going back in time slightly, Howard Johnson's, the hotel and restaurant chain, was opened in Quincy in 1925. While the hotel division became part of the Wyndham brand back in the 1980s, the restaurants continued to operate until March 2022. In 1948, Bill Rosenberg opened a coffee and donut shop he called Open Kettle in Quincy. 2 years later, he renamed it to Dunkin' Donuts, which has gone on to become one of the largest such chains in the world. Back to the quarries. In 1963, the last Granite Quarry closed and began to flood with ground and rainwater. Local kids and university students were prone to jumping from the heights of the quarries into their flooded depths. This behavior was leading to injuries and fatalities, so local officials decided to float a bunch of old telephone poles in the water to discourage jumping. Unfortunately, once saturated in water, these poles sank just below the surface where they couldn't be seen, and fatalities rose dramatically. In response to this, the quarries were drained, and they were then filled with material excavated from the Big Dig project in 1985. The area is now Quincy Quarries Reservation, a 22-acre site used by hikers, rock climbers, and graffiti artists. Ever since the shuttering of the quarries and the shipyard, Quincy's economy has shifted from manufacturing to the professional and service sectors. The population of Quincy has grown steadily since its founding, aside from a slight dip in the 1970s. As of 2010, the population of Quincy was 92,271, and it had the highest per capita population of people with Asian heritage of any city in Massachusetts. Today, Quincy is a beautiful and incredibly history-rich city. Alright, that's all I've got to say about the real-world Quincy, but I do have some notes on this content before closing things out. First, as I just mentioned, Quincy has the highest per capita population of people with Asian heritage of any city in Massachusetts. Of that population, many are of Chinese heritage. It's disappointing that this didn't affect the lore of the city and the Fallout universe at all. Chinese Americans in the Fallout universe do not have an easy life. They face everything from harassment to internment in camps reminiscent of the Japanese internment during World War II. If I'd known before playing Fallout 4 that Quincy has a large Chinese American population, I would have expected that this would have been a part of the story of the city. This could have gone a few ways, but I would have pictured either A, the town would have a surveillance network where the government was watching the citizens with a Chinese background, or B, that the town would have a bunch of apartments with government relocation notices on them, and possibly even a camp that held the former residents of the city somewhere nearby. This would have been a grim bit of storytelling, but well within the norms of the Fallout franchise. Second, I've seen a lot of hate from Marcy Long over the years. To be fair, she is quite rude to the sole survivor, despite the sole survivor saving her life and providing her with a safe place to live. But I think most forget what she's been through. I would appreciate it if she would soften in her anger over time, but I can't imagine the trauma she's been through in the month before we meet her. Her son was murdered in his own bed in the home that was taken from her. Her friends are dead. Her husband has had a nervous breakdown. She's been on the run from ghouls and raiders for a month. All of these factors could easily break a person or harden them into severe unpleasantness. She is absolutely an unpleasant person, but I think that she's earned it. Third, I mentioned the story of the Peabody family, Matt, Carol, and Billy. What I didn't say is that Billy ducked into a refrigerator like Indiana Jones did in the awful fourth movie. Unlike Dr. Jones, Billy became a ghoul, and he survived in that refrigerator for 210 years. You can help him out by shooting the door off the fridge and bringing him home to his parents. As you leave the fridge, you are confronted by a gunner named Bullet, who strangely wants to buy Billy. I hadn't thought the gunners were slavers, but it seems that some of them are. Anyway, upon bringing Billy home, he reunites with his parents, only for Bullet to return with reinforcements. After battling to save the Peabodys, they reward you with 250 caps and tell you about their lives. I'll just say that this is a strange story that adds a lot of understanding to the biology of ghouls. The Peabodys relate that they believe that the potential to ghoulify rather than die from high levels of radiation may be a genetic trait, and I can easily see that. Along with that, for 210 years, Billy never had to eat or drink. It seems that ghouls don't need food or drink to survive. The only way this makes any sense is if ghouls can metabolize ambient radiation. Otherwise, we're violating the law of conservation of mass and energy. Ghouls move, and energy has to be expended for that to happen. Thus, they have to get that energy from something. I'll grant you that Billy was in a cramped space for those 2 centuries, but he was still thinking, another activity that requires energy input. Anyway, the only part of this story that really doesn't make any sense is that Billy is sane. After 2 centuries of solitary confinement, he's still somehow sane. Of all the outlandish parts of this story, that makes the least sense. Anyway, back to the other notes. Fourth, as to why the Gunners attacked Quincy, I don't believe that there's any reason given in the world. That being said, I don't believe that they were hired to do it. I believe that they assaulted it to take it for their own needs. Quincy was a fortified outpost nearby to their headquarters. I think they took it to secure their own holdings. Fifth, there were a pair of citizens in Quincy that escaped the massacre before it happened. The fact that we can find their skeletons tells us they didn't get far. The fact that we can find their skeletons less than a year after the Quincy Massacre also raises the question of why there are still fully intact corpses in Appalachia 6 years after the scorching. Anyway though, there's a note in their luggage near the Adam Cat's garage that explains their plans to flee north. The note also mentions a stash of bottle caps in a dumpster that is still present in the dumpster next to the Adam Cat's garage. Sixth, these trailers on the edge of Quincy Quarries are pretty comical, and let me tell you why. I stood my character next to one of these blocks. Now, assuming that my character is about 6 feet tall, we can see that these blocks are about 1.5 times that height, or about 9 feet. So we're looking at 9 foot by 9 foot by 9 foot cubes of granite. A cubic foot of granite weighs about 170 pounds. Each of these cubes is made up of 729 cubic feet for a total of 123,930 pounds of granite. Your average trailer like this can hold about a third of that weight, 44,000 pounds. This trailer has about 371,790 pounds of granite on it. There's no way in hell these trailers would be able to handle this much weight, much less move. There's a good chance that even if you did get these things moving, they'd end up collapsing any small bridges you cross. Granite is not utilized in blocks like this for good reason. Along with this, it should be noted that the guide for Fallout 4 lists the material here as marble. I went with granite as the real-world Quincy Quarries are famous for their granite. Seventh, the railroad has marked Quincy with a danger rail sign at the gate to the park and ride. Eighth, while there are multiple accounts relating that the Gunners blew a support to access the elevated highway, that's not apparent in the world. There are no toppled supports to be found on the sections of the highway with immediate access to Quincy. Ninth, the Gunner blood type tattoo is reminiscent of a similar tattoo used by the SS for the same reason. The main purpose is that if a gunner is incapacitated in combat, there's no need to look up or test for their blood type. The medic can simply check the tattoo and administer blood without fear of an adverse reaction. The tattoos also serve to mark the members of the Gunners. The Gunners have committed atrocities in the Commonwealth, and in the future, these tattoos could be used just like their real-world counterparts to identify war criminals. 10th, there's a lighthouse on the coast southeast of Quincy. I looked into it, and the closest lighthouse to Quincy in that direction is found in Scituate, Massachusetts, 15 miles away to the east-southeast. 11th, the coastline around Boston has been heavily influenced by land reclamation. Warwick Homestead sits on the end of a peninsula called Howe's Neck at the point called Nut Island. It is called this because it was at one point an actual island, connected to the mainland by nothing more than a sandbar that was only visible at low tide. A causeway was eventually built connecting it to the mainland, and the land around the causeway was filled in, turning this old island into the peninsula it is today. 12th, another note on the old Nut Island sewage treatment plant. In January 1976, the real-world Nut Island Waste Treatment Center suffered a failure that resulted in the release of a massive quantity of raw sewage into Boston Harbor. This failure was studied by Paul F. Levy, the executive director of the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. He published a report in 2001 that stated the cause of this spill was the result of organizational behavior that he referred to as the Nut Island effect. This phenomena occurs when you have a team of skilled workers running an operation that becomes isolated from their managers. The workers who want to work without interference avoid communication with their managers, taking care of problems themselves. The managers start to view these workers as self-sufficient and avoid communication as well. When real problems start to crop up that the workers can't handle, like the need to replace aging and expensive equipment that can no longer be jerry-rigged, those requests fall on deaf ears. Eventually this causes a failure, such as the one that occurred at the Nut Island Waste Treatment Facility. Amazingly, the repercussions of this failure are still being felt today as the work continues on the sewage control systems. Lastly, those of you in the know may have noticed that I didn't mention the Eddie Winter case at all, and that I didn't really elaborate on the Atom Cats or the Gunners as a whole. Have no fear, I will detail all these things in the future. I just wanted to make sure to cover Quincy specifically here. Alright, I think that'll do it for the story of Quincy. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. I've been streaming on YouTube lately. I'm currently streaming Saturday afternoons when I have the time, so if you're interested, come check it out. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios, Brian, and Real76 for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.